So where does like wealth, image, fame, and power, and all that kind of come into STT?
Yeah, this is an important one because we're back to talking about human nature and how it's not just a blank slate and anything goes, and how all cultures are cool, or all cultures are equally good, and it's just which one you choose to prefer. So this is drawing on something called goal contents theory, and it's not just the motivation that we have to do a task. How motivated am I to do this interview? Okay, it's also what are we doing? What are the kind of values and goals that people have in their life, and how does that affect motivation, and how does that affect well-being? And what SDT says is that there are certain things. Firstly, there are certain things that are more aligned with our psychological needs than others, and it's kind of obvious, but you can prove it. And so I'll start with something obvious. Like if you want somebody to murder somebody else, that's going to be harder for them to do fundamentally than can you go to the shop and get me a packet of crisps? Okay, and there's a reason for that. It's because it clashes fundamentally with their basic psychological needs innately. But we don't have to look at something so extreme as that. We live in a culture which is extremely materialistic, extremely egotistical. We've never lived in a society ever which is as narcissistic and egotistical and materialistic before in the existence of our species for the last 200,000 or 300,000 years. It's shocking, and this is something which it's killing us. It's wearing people down from the inside. And okay, so where does self-determination theory come into this? I suppose the question is, what animates people? What do people want, and what actually satisfies us? And this comes back to at the very start, I was talking about this debate about human nature, and people saying, well, what people really want when it comes down to it is they're greedy. They just want, you're talking about their wealth, image, fame, and power. People want money, they want fame, they want to look good, they want approval, and they want dominance and to move up the hierarchy. And obviously we have those tendencies, or else it wouldn't happen. But what self-determination theory shows is that these aspirations cannot actually provide well-being for people. So, for example, there's one study that looked at meaning in life. Long story short, it found that people who pursue these things and even achieve them did not reliably attain a sense of meaning in their life. In contrast to what? In contrast to what are called the intrinsic life aspirations. Okay, so personal growth, community or contribution, and relationships. And there is ample evidence to show that these are the things which actually provide well-being for people. I guess. So what do we do with that? I guess some of this is obvious. Again, a lot of the value is in the actual study and quantitative proof of these results. It directs us to what kind of society do we need to create to actually create flourishing. It shows basically that this kind of materialism and egotism doesn't work. Even it's just this. I guess something else we could say is, when we look at it from the point of view of what kind of society do we want to live in and can we live in, one thing is, we'll talk more about this because we want to get on to talking about political economy more and move out of just the introductory material on self-determination theory in general. Is capitalism compatible with human nature? And we talk a lot about, is socialism compatible with human nature? Is capitalism compatible with human nature? I think there's very strong evidence that it isn't. And one reason is just what we were talking about there. Capitalism systematically produces and proliferates these materialistic and egotistical values. And it actually relies on them. They're functional to the system. It relies on the unquenchable pursuit of wealth, image, power, and fame to drive people to reproduce the system. What self-determination theory shows is two things. Is one, that will never make people flourish. It will never really allow people to grow and be at ease with themselves and achieve fulfillment. And the second thing is that people will never properly internalize these values, that will always be at odds with themselves, because these values and aspirations they're incompatible with human nature, our basic psychological needs. And so it's unstable. It can only be maintained with this psychological fragmentation and tension war within ourselves and a war against each other. And then also talking about internalization and goals, we won't ever really be able to bring these into ourselves and then be optimally motivated. And then on the other side, the society which really is compatible with human nature is the one where the dominant aspirations are these intrinsic life aspirations. It's your contribution to society, community involvement, your relationships, and personal growth. That is pointing immediately towards socialism. Okay, we've been talking a lot about the environment. Okay, self-determination theory is big on the social environment. Basic psychological needs, cultural transmission, values, how other people treat you, messages, so forth. Okay. But there's also the individual. What does the individual bring to the environment? Okay, we don't all behave the same. So there is a theory of individual differences called causality orientation theory. Your causality orientation is effectively the individual motivational style that you have. And so this, there are three different ones. Everything in self-determination theory comes in threes. So there's the autonomous style, the controlled style, and the impersonal style. And that's basically when an individual goes into their environment, do they look for opportunities to take responsibility, to show initiative, choice, to assert their needs and boundaries and make the most of things? That's the autonomous style. When somebody goes into an environment, do they immediately look for an authority figure to tell them what to do? Are they immediately trying to look for approval from other people or to manage their behavior so they're not judged or rejected, or aligning themselves with financial incentives and so on? That's a controlled style. And then the impersonal, that's, does somebody go into an environment and they just believe that they have no control? They're helpless. Okay. And the point here is that this is really, really important. Okay. And it comes to a general point about socialism and the importance of education in the home that I'm going to make after this, which is even if you put people into a suboptimal environment. So the idea is that everybody has bits of these three styles within them to different extents. Some are more autonomous, more controlled, more impersonal. Okay. Even if you throw somebody into a suboptimal environment, if somebody has a very strong autonomous style, they're buffered against that. So if you put somebody into an environment where there's a lot of hierarchy and authority and incentives and pressures, somebody with a strong autonomous style has enough agency and a robust enough self that they will power themselves through it. They'll be resistant to it. And the negative effects of that. On the inverse case, if you put somebody into a really healthy, optimal environment, which is very supportive of basic psychological needs, somebody comes into that with a very strong, controlled and impersonal style, they won't make the most of that environment. They'll be untouched by it. They'll ruin it for themselves, basically. This is so important because it brings us to this question of the production of people within society. Okay, we can't just think about people as fully formed and how do people, fully formed adults at the age of 40 or something, and how do people act. You have to look at the process of how are people formed from age 0 through childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and what people become. And this is crucial because if you're looking at socialism, and we're getting now into this, when you look at socialism, my contention is that motivation is fundamental. It's one of the fundamental I was arguing this in Montreal, the conference. It's a fundamental prerequisite for socialism is the correct motivational quality, autonomous motivation. And if you have a society which is systematically generating people, forming people to have this controlled style where it's all just about rewards, punishments, authority, conformity, and ego, and the impersonal style of helplessness and apathy, you're never going to have a well-functioning society, no matter what it is. You're certainly not going to have a socialist society. So then you need to look at how are people formed, and you have to look at lots of things. Okay, we talk a lot about the media and the workplace and incentives and things like that. But one of the things is, I would argue, self-determination theory shows us why actually school and home are sites and institutions which are as fundamental as the workplace for socialism. We talk a lot about how should the workplace be organized, and then to a lesser extent we talk about how should the community be organized, democracy and so forth. It's also school. We spent 14 years, let's say, most of us, in school, and then the home. And what this is doing, it is creating these adults who have this motivational style, this way of behaving, values, the life aspirations. Are we materialistic and egotistical, or are we aspiring for these other things? Do we have this sense of agency? Do we have this orientation towards doing things that matter to us? We're resistant to conformity, or are we, the opposite? It points to a fundamental, I would say, contradiction, flaw in capitalism, which is that it's not able to do that.
So Ferdia, we've talked a lot about SDT. We've gone into like its kind of foundational elements. What can SDT tell us then about political economy?
Okay, yeah, this is important. The first thing I'll say is self-determination theory has done some work directly on political economy, in the sense that it has been extended into, it's been applied quite extensively at this point in work in organizations. It's had some influence on management consultancy, HR. Also, it has been applied somewhat to politics and to economics. However, that's quite incipient. A lot of work needs to be done, and that's work that I'm trying to do, and others. Okay, but there's some stuff that has been done. But let's talk about that now. All right. Well, look, political economy, motivation is one of the central constructs of political economy, and so self-determination theory tells us a lot about motivation. Political economy, in a nutshell, it's about information and motivation. So SDT helps us about motivation. So questions, what kind of question? What are the fundamental questions in political economy? There are things like, how do people gain access to the resources that they need to reproduce themselves and flourish? So question of compensation, for example. How should we organize production? So how do we organize our workplaces? How do we relate to one another? What kind of role does authority have in society? How should people be socialized? So socialization is the process of people developing and being inculcated in the values and practices and habits of that society. That's what we were talking before about school and home. How should people be socialized? These are all fundamental questions of political economy. How do we organize government? What is legitimate government and illegitimate government? Another question that I care about a lot in the theory of post-capitalism is the question of entrepreneurship. I know you don't like that word, but it's the issue, we could say, of creating projects and institutions, whether they're companies or they're organizations, creating a product or a process.
The discovery process. The discovery process.
Yeah, the discovery process, as you like to call it. So this is an issue that has been really neglected in the theory of post-capitalism. Been a lot of emphasis historically on static allocation. And actually the harder problem is this one of dynamic efficiency, or, creative destruction, the discovery process, like you say. And so the issue of motivation looms large here. Why will people create new organizations and projects and products if they don't do it, let's say, with the prospect of gaining enormous fortune? And so this is something that we can begin to answer this question using self-determination theory. So that's a smattering of issues.
So let's talk about pay then. What has SDT got to tell us about what types of pay are deleterious to human flourishing?
Yeah, this is a really, really important point. I want to say something briefly about, okay, so why does this matter? So from a political economics standpoint, why does this matter? It matters because obviously it shapes people's life chances. What income you have, it determines the kind of life that you get to live. But it also shapes society, the way that people think about themselves and fit into that society, and the attitudes that people have, and the formation of classes. I would say that self-determination theory gives us the best psychological framework to begin answering this, but there needs to be more work done. However, there's a lot we can say. So the first is, so I gave a talk about this in Montreal as an introduction to self-determination theory, and people were asking me about what SDT had said about income. And I said that research on real organizations and pay within that was very incipient and scant. And that was a mistake. I misspoke there because I was thinking about certain questions, but that has actually been studied a lot, let's say on a particular type of pay. So what we know is, for example, that pay for performance, as it's called, is very harmful. So this would be your classic sales regime, where you have quotas and you're given a large proportion of your income is commission based. So your pay is contingent on a certain level of performance. It's interesting because this is the classic economic argument for capitalism. It's this kind of like you're paid based on your marginal productivity, at least in classical economics. Anyway, so psychologically, this is the worst. There's actually quite a lot of evidence, and it's not just really basic principled argument. It's from studying real organizations, and it shows that this type of payment regime creates very high turnover intentions, burnout. It creates situations where people are morally disengaged, are less likely to help each other, all around disastrous. So that's one clear lesson. Pay for performance is harmful. So then we can move on to other ways of paying people. Though this is where it becomes more complex than what I was talking about in Montreal, where we need more study. I mean, you and I were, and Simon Suterluti were having lots of discussions about this, about the issue of, well, should we pay people at all in socialism? Should you pay people per hour, even if it's everybody gets paid the same, for example? Should you do that? What kind of influence does that have on people? Does that create controlled motivation, where people are just acting according to these financial incentives and they get entrained towards those, but they lose sight of the bigger picture and their values? And that is a question where I think we can't make definitive statements. But what we can do is we can make some arguments about, we can make some, for example, okay, because I want to say things that we can state with confidence. We can talk about the whole context of pay, right? So in capitalist ideology and economics, the role of pay and motivation is very central, and it's treated as the primary factor which motivates people. And what self-determination theory does is it allows us to take a step back and ask us, actually from first principles, what motivates people. And this brings us back to the basic psychological needs. So this is a way that we can generally engage with the possibility of a socialist society. Okay, we step back, we stop taking this view, or we stop engaging in this discourse at the level of what regime of financial incentives will we be able to put in place in order to make people do the things that we want? And then we ask, what actually motivates people? And so when we see it's when people's basic psychological needs are satisfied, when we make that move, it reorients us to looking at, okay, if we want people to have optimal motivation at work, then we need to satisfy people's basic psychological needs. And that's a very different way of looking at things. And so then we can think about, how do we make these very direct interventions into supporting people's basic psychological needs? Like, how do you support somebody's autonomy? How do you support someone's belonging? And how do you support someone's competence? And there's many things that you can do to satisfy these basic needs without talking about pay at all. And so that's something that's very important. And it's things which align very strongly with classic socialist proposals and themes. I'd say this is an important point, specifically libertarian socialist, in the sense of concerned with personal development and autonomy, and not command-based and hierarchy-based. The most important thing about pay is, so there's this idea of salience. So it's how much is pay in the forefront of your mind. So when a reward is substantial, it's significant, and when it's salient, so people are aware that the reason they're doing something is to get this reward, that is when you get the most negative effects. That's when you really trigger a control motivation. And if you want to pay people, what you want is you want pay to fade into the background. And it's just kind of a matter of routine. Everybody knows that, they get their paycheck, and that is just, it's functional, it's perfunctory. It allows you to access resources and so forth, but you're not thinking about it during the day.
So this is the functional versus informational significance of the pay.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a really important point. Functional significance. So SGT, it's all about our perceived meaning of the situation as well. That's something.
Well, it's interesting. You're talking about like control motivation, but like here when we talk about when pay becomes less important is by changing these things that are essentially that induce these competency or well-being. So like actually giving control to people of their working life, it would seem to me as something that would push pay way back into the as something that's not even that important when some people has control over their working life, this kind of unalienated working life. It would seem to me that the socialists often get caught up on talking about pay and stuff, and they don't really focus on the control of production.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's fundamental. I mean, a lot of socialists are thinking. I mean, obviously, there's a huge diversity contained within the label socialist or communist, but you can end up with this absurd kind of inverse consumerism, and where it just ends up amounting to the same thing. So humans are just these kind of, we're just reduced to our physiological needs, and it's all just about shoveling loaves of bread and toasters and into us, and moving shekels around in order to achieve that, and as if that's all that human beings want or need. And there's this complete lack of this. What I was talking at the beginning, this psychological dimension, and we're psychological beings, and that's the entire purpose of life and society. So yeah, talking about the basic psychological needs. I mean, control over production. Having an influence over decisions, participation, having your perspective taken into account, not being dominated, not being controlled, not being bossed around, having a sense of collegiality with your co-workers, having a sense that you are actually in it together, you share burdens, you help each other, you're not competing ruthlessly with each other. Okay, so that's belonging. The first thing was autonomy, obviously. Competence. Are you doing something that is actually challenging? Are you just doing road work? Are you doing something that doesn't harness your abilities, your talents? Are you actually having an opportunity to develop? I mean, that's it's fundamental to socialism, is the idea that work is not just a means to producing an output. It's that we are the output. It's the journey. It's not just the destination. It's that work is something that, and this is something that is obviously comes out of Marx and anarchism and so forth, and that is developed much more strongly in self-determination theory. It's this idea that we have this need to be productive and to work and do things that are useful. And so,
But that was all getting very self-helpy. It's the journey, not the destination, man. So like you break down like you have like, I'm just looking at some of the stuff you sent me. You break the pay stuff is broken down to lots of detail. Say between like heuristic versus algorithmic tasks, complex versus simple tasks.
Oh yeah, this is a really important one.
Yeah, can you dig into some of this stuff?
Yeah, so complex versus simple, and heuristic versus algorithmic. So basically, you have tasks that are so algorithmic and simple tasks are ones that they can just be broken down into a sequence of steps that are repeated. They don't require any kind of initiative or cognitive flexibility. So an example would be, let's say, very basic data entry or moving things on an assembly line. Okay. And the opposite of that is complex and heuristic. So heuristic is just a fancy word for rules of thumb. So you need flexible thinking. You need to actually figure things out. And what the evidence shows, experiments show, is that going back to autonomous and control motivation can be effective in improving performance and productivity in simple and algorithmic tasks. It can. Okay. Like if you give people really boring, pointless work that they see, they just don't understand the point of it. It doesn't mean anything to them. There's no interest, there's no challenge, there's no development. Well, yeah, if you try to manipulate their behavior through pay, that will increase performance because there's no other lever. There's no other way to motivate them. So that does actually work. I mean, there's nuances, like people can, again, become apathetic and defiant and so on. But where control motivation doesn't work is these heuristic and complex tasks. Okay. Anything that requires creativity, flexibility, initiative, autonomy in the cybernetic sense, control motivation is very ineffective, and it can actually backfire. And so then you need autonomous motivation. And it's an observation that has been made here in the work on working organizations within this self-determination theory literature, that in a world where more and more work is becoming heuristic and complex, autonomous motivation is only becoming more important. In this increasingly complex world where you have workers needing to act with flexibility and creativity and initiative, a control motivation is just becoming more and more obsolete. And it's really good that we're going into this now, because again, I want to emphasize SDT isn't this and the application of it to political economy and to post-capitalism. It's not this fluffy feel-good story. It's also about performance. And we're back to this idea that socialism is, it's a more effective and efficient form of society than capitalism. It's not going to do everything as well. You're not going to probably not going to be having people delivering like ice cream to your door on a bicycle at 3:30 in the morning. Okay. But in general, it's a society which is actually better able to harness human productivity. Yeah, I mean, we're talking before about the TPS, targeted production system. This is obviously something that applies to what we call knowledge work, to professionals. Okay, people who have managerial discretion or have roles which are, inverted commas, creative, and so forth. But increasingly, this is something that's applicable to what have traditionally been considered more routine roles in manufacturing and service organizations. And the point being, then we need to start. So control motivation, autonomous motivation. And we need to start targeting people's, again, basic psychological needs: autonomy, belonging, competence, in order to try to bring out that autonomous motivation, that initiative, that flexibility. Okay, rather than just trying to manipulate people through pay. That has diminishing returns. There's a ceiling, and it's one of the fundamental contradictions of capitalism, because the property relations of capitalism and the structural centrality of managerial authority is a constant friction in implementing those organizational changes, of orienting organizations to the basic psychological needs rather than hierarchy, command, and financial incentives.
It was interesting when we were in SASI, or whatever it's called.
Yes,
In Montreal. We're at a conference there, myself and Ferdia, a few months ago in July, June, in association with INDEP, who I've mentioned before on the podcast. Ferdia was one of the founding members. But we're having like some discussions with some of the communism people, with Simon Suterluti, and he was kind of making this case that problem with, say, like he gave a lecture on, say, the German East German state. From a political economy point of view, was that like people were a link between their work and the amount of consumption they had. That this was the core dynamic, and from my point of view, I would say that it's kind of missing the point somewhat, as in, like, it's exploitation and it's alienation from the workplace. It's falling rate of profit. It's all of these things that come out of a system based on exploitation and wage labor, not so much the linking of, say, your consumption to your performance of social labor in particular. Like, we can see from what you're talking about here, like, that once pay is really not the issue, what's really kind of the most important thing is to have psychological well-being through the work, through the productive apparatus. And that, like, we can say, was just as capitalism is based on alienated labor. We look at, say, the East German state or the Soviet state, or where, take your pick, that the work was still deeply alienating and based still on control motivation.
Yeah. So, like you're saying, I was part of those conversations as well, which were really interesting. And I was a bit in between the two of you. I'm ambivalent about this question. And where I would start is picking up at the end of what you said there about control motivation. I think from a motivational point of view, the question is, are people acting out of controlled motivation or autonomous motivation? And then we're trying to figure out what regimes of pay in what context lead to control motivation or not. So it's not so much about the pay itself, it's about what the pay does.
But you see,
and specifically through the construct of control motivation.
But you see, I think it's not like I think you said something there, like the pay leads to the does the type of pay lead to control motivation? And I
Yeah.
think that the causality is the other way around. Is like the regime of pay is an actual expression of the control motivation inherent in the productive apparatus.
Yes, I mean exactly. It's both, and this is a really good point. It's another point that we can say. It applies to, for example, managerial authority, or it applies to political authoritarianism and coercion as well. And conformity is, and there's this feedback loop which operates, which when you have a society which is authoritarian, and I consider manipulating people through financial incentives as a form of authoritarianism, and I understand that precisely through self-determination theory. And it comes back to this autonomy. Does it support autonomy or not? If it's frustrating autonomy, that's what authoritarianism is. So when you have authoritarian societies which rely on manipulating people, inducing behavior, so whether it's obeying laws or it's doing work through control motivation, what happens is it's like you deplete the soil. You deplete the motivational soil. We become psychologically barren and infertile, and that means that, like you're saying there, you actually have to rely even more on control motivation, even more on coercion and conformity and financial incentives. And so this is the chicken and egg problem in the transition to socialism, of course, is when you, and what I was saying about causality orientations, right? The individual motivational style. If you have a population which is just riven with controlled motivation and impersonal, controlled style, the impersonal style, and it's just there waiting for an authority and a financial incentive and not having the sense of agency, how do you deal with that without applying that financial incentive or command? But it works the other way as well, which is that a certain regime of pay, a certain regime in the division of labor will support or thwart control motivation too. And one of the lessons, actually, this is really important. There's so many important things in self-determination theory. One of the really important things that self-determination theory shows is that people can actually change quite quickly. We're very sensitive to our immediate environment. And I talked about the individual motivational style and how that can make us resistant to what the environment is. But the evidence shows that when you change the environment, so let's say, if you change the way a particular organization functions, for example, the way that people behave and think can change quite rapidly too. So that's something that's hopeful, I suppose. But yeah, back to that point. So the regime of pay does then also have an effect. And so then the question is, what is that regime of pay? Now, we know, for example, if we go in and try to have a socialist society which is based on pay for performance, you're going to have people acting out of control motivation, and you're just going to reproduce capitalist motivation basically in behavior. It's not going to work. In psychological terms, the question then is, what, if any, form of pay?
But also classes. We have classes, right?
Oh yeah, classes for sure. Yeah, classes
yeah.
for sure. I'm just talking about it from a psychological perspective, but I mean, obviously, class dynamics have psychological implications as well. It's all connected. I'm just talking about it on the psychological level. And so then the question is, what, if any, regime of pay is consistent with autonomous motivation? And I don't think that we can say for sure yet, based on what we know, based on what research has been done. Or we can make arguments and outline about what conditions would have to be satisfied. I think that there's, about this particular argument, I think there's arguments for and against. It's a very complicated issue. It's really complicated because it interacts with all sorts of things about what notions of fairness prevail in that society, how intrinsically motivating work is, what kind of technology is available, what is the motivational kind of stock, as it were, within the society at that time. I mean, one of the things that self-determination theory provides is this idea of socialist consciousness. I'm just thinking there of, it's obviously this very changing the nature of people. So it's always been a very important idea in socialism. I'm thinking there about papers written by David Leibman. He talks about socialist consciousness and the transition to socialism, which is good. And I think that SDT provides us more detail on what that is, preconditions for what it means for people to have, inverted commas, socialist consciousness and to move there. Yeah, so it's a bit frustrating. That's pretty much what we can say about pay. I mean, I could say other things, but the thing which is really to be emphasized is you have to get controlled motivation out of the equation as quickly as possible and as thoroughly as possible. And that takes time, but I mean, and that was a talk that I gave at Historical Materialism, where you and I organized some panels, and the whole talk there was about how once you have a society in which controlled motivation is rife and which relies on controlled motivation to induce behavior, you just have a failed system, because that leads to strategic gaming. And it's a cybernetic argument of requisite variety, law of requisite variety. If you have these autonomous agents who you can't perfectly control, making decisions, and you're trying to control them through incentives, through control motivation, they'll always find a way, a loophole, a way to evade the control. That's one reason that capitalism can never work, and it's a crucial issue for socialism, and it's a crucial.
Here's a question for you. Here's a question for you, Ferdia.
Yeah.
How much money would I need to pay you for you to get rid of your intrinsic motivation?
To get rid of my intrinsic motivation?
No, it's a joke. But how much do I have to pay you to stop intrinsically motivating you for the rest of your life?
I don't know. Do you know what? It could actually be not very much.
What?
It could actually be not very. It could be not very much. It all depends on the context, and this is why it's very difficult to work out in the abstract.
But surely you'd never be able to stop somebody being intrinsically motivated, because they'd always be intrinsically motivated. But you'd pay them. Like you could change they could change their behavior, but you'd never change their motivation.
No, you can get rid of people's intrinsic motivation.
Can you?
Oh yeah, you can eliminate it. Yeah.
Like what?
I mean, okay, so let's say I play guitar. I'm a musician, right? And I play guitar and write songs and things like that. And I do that primarily out of intrinsic motivation, because I find it enjoyable, interesting, challenging. But if you manipulated me in such a way that I was just doing this to gain the approval of other people, or just to get a paycheck, I might lose my intrinsic motivation almost entirely, in the sense that I'd stop playing. I'd stop picking up the guitar. I'd stop writing songs. And so you can actually crush people's intrinsic motivation. You can extinguish it. Now, what you can't do is you cannot eliminate people's inherent capacity for intrinsic motivation.
Right, that's what I kind of meant. Get rid of all of your intrinsic motivation, not a particular one.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's the thing. It's back to we're inherently motivated. So all you can do is suppress it through the environmental conditions.
So there's also this notion that the pay has to be perceived as equitable.
Yeah, there's some experimental research on this, which I don't want to talk about because it's quite tentative. But what I'd say generally is, in the literature, there are two concepts: distributional justice and procedural justice. Procedural justice is whether things are considered to be transparent and operating according to consistent rules that are fair. And then distributional justice, or distributive justice, which is the actual pattern of distribution of the income or the resources. This is something which affects motivation. Well, the first thing to note there is that there's two parts to that. So it could be possible that there's a lot of work that can be done in the procedural justice. You can conceive of having a workplace where people are paid different amounts, and as long as it happens very transparently according to rules that people perceive as fair, and perceive as fair, for example, because it's autonomy supportive, everybody's involved, they make the decision together through workers' council, assembly, and so forth. That might be enough for it to be perceived as fair, and therefore to actually sustain autonomous motivation. It's hard to say. What role does the distributive justice have? But it's obviously important. Like if you pay people in a way where they think the actual distribution is unfair, and you have some people making much more than others and so forth, I mean, this can obviously undermine motivation. And so there's a whole issue of income equality, and there's lots of evidence from self-determination theory and then also outside of it. A lot of people will have read The Spirit Level and stuff like that, about how income and wealth inequality in society is toxic to everybody. It's toxic within organizations. It really can produce a lot of competition and resentment and gaming behavior and so forth. One thing is the reasons that people have for wanting money also matter. And this adds another level of nuance. So there's layers and layers and layers of nuance. So why do you want the money? I guess, you could say this comes back to what we were talking about before, about the intrinsic and extrinsic life aspirations, the wealth, image, fame, power versus relationships, personal growth, and community. And so what are your motivations for wanting the money as well? So for example, if you want money so you can help your family, or you can do something to help other people, or something which supports you in developing yourself in a very authentic way, that's very different in the effect that's going to have on your motivation than if you want money so that you can be better than other people, for example. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there are general trends and patterns that we can identify that allow us to make statements about what effect pay has. And then there are levels of detail and nuance that complicate it beyond that, where it's difficult for us to say, yes, what we need is to pay everybody like this. So unfortunately, we're not there yet. On a psychological level. On a psychological level, we can make class arguments.
Really class arguments, brilliant arguments.
Yeah, so just to say some more things about political economy, it's really important to observe that when we talk about the transition to socialism, we're talking about a fundamental civilizational shift. We're talking about something that is drastically different. And sometimes when we talk about socialism, we try to preserve many things in capitalism, and we try to kind of almost be capitalism at its own game. And I think what comes out of self-determination theory is the conclusion that you can't do that. We're talking about a shift to drastically different values, drastically different reasons for behaving, and drastically different ways of relating to one another. For example, thinking about consumption. Thinking about ecology, for example. I mean, ecology and the environment, this is something where psychology is crucial. How are we actually going to make the transition to an ecologically harmonious and sustainable society? You're not going to do it through controlled motivation. There's research on this, environmental behaviors, showing how trying to induce people to behave in environmentally friendly ways through controlled motivation is ineffective, and that it's much more effective for people to do this in autonomous ways. But the general context of living in a society where people are just acting out of controlled motivation, trying to maximize their individual utility, their money, their status, and so on. And somehow we're just going to line up the incentives perfectly so that we produce the world that we want. We live in harmony with nature. It's never going to happen. You have to let go of that. There's one thing in terms of a fundamental contradiction in capitalism and limit. So for example, we're talking about entrepreneurship and why people do things. So, what we can say is capitalism is really good at getting people to put a lot of energy into doing things, and it can produce beneficial results. But what I would argue is that there's this fundamental psychological limitation, which is that once you induce people to act out of controlled motivation, it's like putting a train on a track. You're on the track and you can visit everything that's on the track, but nothing that's off of it. Okay. So you can induce people to do things which make money, which produce profit, and which produce private fortunes. And if that happens to coincide with eco-social goals, then we're in luck. But if it doesn't, you're stuck. And this is a lesson about capitalism, which is that the very behavior and attitudes and propensities in people which would be required to make capitalism a functional society are undermined by it constantly. Like, in order to make capitalism a system which was just, ecologically sustainable, and produced flourishing, you would have to have people who are very autonomously motivated and would somehow be able to resist the corruption which is endemic in capitalism. Doing all of these cruel, callous, unjust things, destroying nature, destroying people. But on the other hand, capitalism systematically undermines autonomous motivation and is always harnessing controlled motivation. Is always harnessing ego, always harnessing instrumentality. And so it keeps us on that track. And so it will never be able to rise above its limitations because it destroys the psychological material which is required to transcend it. And that is, to me, that's an argument. I was talking about this before. It's on par with things like capitalism is prone to crisis.
Okay, so we've seen like attempts by the high road capitalist firms to try and integrate some of this STT type stuff. Sometimes before STT even existed. like the
Yeah.
TPS and stuff like this. I was wondering, what does SDT then specifically have to say about these types of work environments? Or does it actually have much to say about them? And does it say anything about or the inability for this to be generalized in capitalism?
Well, yes, it does. So it's fascinating. This is the tendency of capitalism to grope towards solutions to its systematic problems by moving in the direction of socialist relations. And obviously, you've talked about this a lot, and so has Donald. And so-called high road firms and trends within the toilet production system and the vanguard method and other such organizational forms and trends will try to solve problems in production by changing the way that people relate to one another within the organization. So, for example, in the TPS, the fundamental problem that the TPS, the toilet production system, is trying to solve, and also the vanguard method, which is the application of lean to services, is how do you increase the variety of the production process? How do you increase the ability of the production process to be able to flexibly respond to the demands of production? That's complicated, obviously, but one of the things that you have to do is you have to rely on frontline workers, whether it's on an assembly line or it's in a call center, to act flexibly. Like we were talking about before, you're moving from the simple and algorithmic work to now heuristic and complex work, where people have to make decisions, people have to solve problems on the fly, have to exercise initiative. And in order to do that, you can't just rely on controlled motivation anymore, as we saw. You have to harness autonomous motivation. So you have to start organizing things to support people's basic psychological needs, where they see meaning in it, where they have control, where they're not being terrorized by their management and coerced through, like in the vanguard method, the first thing they do is they go and they get rid of all the bonuses. Or one of the things they do is they go and they get rid of the bonuses and they empower frontline workers to make decisions. But we can see this through a psychological view. Obviously, Seddon was a psychologist, So, and we see that the TPS as well, when you have an assembly line, you're relying then on assembly workers to be able to stop the line, solve a problem, constantly be engaging in continuous improvement. So you're not just relying anymore on these upper management to be the brains of the organization. You're harnessing the intelligence throughout the entire organization. But then the question is, well, why would workers do that? If workers just see themselves as cogs where the psychological needs aren't being met, why would they do that? So then you have to start empowering people. But when you start empowering people to make decisions and to be respected members of an organization, and stop trying to manipulate people through a hierarchy of responsibility and a hierarchy of pay scales, now you're doing something which is very dangerous within the social relations of capitalism. Now you're bumping up against the fundamental relations of capitalism, which is that the organization operates to produce profit and serve the board of directors and the shareholders. Their authority, so the imperatives of capital, are transmitted down through unquestionable managerial authority, and the workers carry out their orders and are manipulated through financial incentives. Now you're moving away from that to a more cooperative model. And that's something that we see when we read about the TPS. Why is the TPS so often not implemented properly? And you just end up with lean introduced as a set of tools that aren't properly integrated. There's lots of reasons for that. And similarly in Vanguard, there are lots of reasons why that isn't done properly. One reason is because, so let's say in Vanguard, it's often because managers aren't willing to let go of their control. And that can be ideological. It can be because they're trained a certain way and they genuinely believe that people work a certain way and they have a notion of efficiency. But it's also because what happens when you start letting go of managerial authority? The ability of capital to reproduce itself disintegrates. You start moving towards socialism. And that's something that capitalism generally cannot accommodate, because then it's not capitalism anymore. When you have an organization which is run democratically by workers, where people aren't organized through a pay hierarchy of command and control, like you're moving away from capitalism.
So before we were chatting, you were linking the three basic elements of autonomy, competency, and belonging back to a kind of like evolutionary kind of a cybernetic kind of a lens. Do you want to go into that?
Yeah. Oh God. Okay. Yeah. Sure. So yeah, there's a couple of things I'll say about cybernetics. So as your listeners are well aware, you and Donal are cyberneticians who apply cybernetics to the study of society and capitalism and socialism, and that's something that I do as well. And you can very clearly make a link between cybernetics and self-determination theory. There's a couple of ways you can do that. One way is that presentation I was talking about, where I was saying how this is an historical materialism. I was arguing that once you have a society in which controlled motivation is functional to the system and it's systematically harnessed, you're going to have strategic gaming, and you're going to have a failure to align people's behavior with eco-social goals. So eco-social goals being things like preserving the living world, treating people with respect, having safe and supportive working conditions, and so forth. And there's a cybernetic point there. Okay, so talking about the law of requisite variety. So to remind listeners, what is the law of requisite variety? Law of requisite variety, or Ashby's law as it's known, it's a fundamental principle of cybernetics. There are many ways to understand it, but the general idea is that in order for a system to be able to reproduce itself and maintain its viability within an environment, it has to be as complex as that environment. Otherwise, it'll be destroyed. It won't be able to adapt. Another way you can think about it is, this is related to the good regulator theorem as well, is in order for, let's say, one system to control another, it has to have at least the same variety or complexity. So there's a fundamental cybernetic point to be made about autonomous versus controlled motivation. It's basically where the psychological concept of autonomy coincides with the cybernetic notion of autonomy. They mean slightly different things, but they actually meet at a point. And the point is that if you try to regulate and control behavior through a field of, I call it coercion field. Okay, so it's a regime of commands and incentives. You'll have people aligning themselves to that in order to get the reward or avoid the punishment. And sometimes, so let's say if you're trying to create a society which fulfills these eco-social goals, what you'll find is that sometimes those two things will coincide. Effectively, sometimes you'll be able to trick people into doing something good that produces a good outcome. But the fundamental cybernetic point effectively is that this form of control, the controller will never have enough variety to make that alignment complete. And this is where gaming the system comes in. There's always a way when there's some reward function in order to get the reward, okay, so whether that's getting a positive reward or avoiding a punishment, while not actually achieving the goal that the system was set up to achieve. Okay, so this is following the letter of the law rather than the spirit. And where autonomous motivation comes into this is the fundamental cybernetic point is if we want to have a society which fulfills eco-social goals generally, you have to have agents within the system, which happen to be humans in this case, internalizing these goals themselves and autonomously orienting themselves to achieve them. That's the only way that there's going to be enough variety. You're going to have requisite variety. Okay, so it's the lesson is basically you cannot trick people into doing the right thing. Ultimately, people will always find a way to evade it. And so from a cybernetic point of view, you have to have people behaving autonomously, so self-regulating. So this is what the eco-social goal is. I take that, or like I'm an agent, I take that and I try to do that myself. And that requires autonomous motivation. Yeah. So anyway, look, we talked a lot about self-determination theory. What are the most important things to take away? The first is the importance of psychology. Okay, we can't deal with political economy. We can't deal with socialism without having an understanding of human beings and our psychology. The second is the basic ideas in self-determination theory, which is first that motivation is innate, that we have an innate tendency to grow, to become integrated and to be motivated if the basic nutrients in our environment are provided, and that those nutrients are three basic psychological needs which are universal to all humans regardless of culture, and those are autonomy, belonging, and competence. Autonomy being self-endorsement, volition, genuine choice, and alignment. Belonging being mutual care and liking, and competence being a sense of mastery, effectiveness, and impact in your environment. And that those three basic psychological needs, which we all share and are just as fundamental and present as our physiological needs, by the way, on a personal level, these are things that we need to nourish consistently throughout the day. These are implicated in all of the major results in motivation and well-being. And in the case of in motivation, we need to understand that motivation isn't just about being motivated or not motivated, that there are different qualities of motivation, and that SDT breaks those into two fundamental types, which are autonomous and controlled. Autonomous is when you have this sense of choice, your basic psychological needs are met, and you're doing something out of interest or enjoyment or alignment with who you are, your values, versus controlled motivation, which is you're doing something out of ego, out of shame, out of hubris, or just to attain some narrow result, getting a reward or avoiding a punishment. And that in order to have a functional, flourishing society, we need to move to one where we change our values and our goals to focusing on a community contribution, relationships, and personal growth, but also one which systematically harnesses autonomous motivation rather than control motivation. And whether we try, whether we try to implement a capitalist or a socialist society, none of them will work if we keep harnessing control motivation. It will be dysfunctional.
It's really an expression of class society. I think like control motivation is really an expression of class society, as in like you're doing the bidding of somebody else. It expresses something inherent about the ownership or relationship and the control relationship of the means of production. I think they're just baked into the cake.
It is, yeah. And we're molded from infancy into creatures who are susceptible to that.
Was there a Ferdia mold that you were poured into? Is this what you're saying?
Yeah, there was, but I won't get into that. Yeah.
Well, on that note, Ferdia, thanks very much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for having me. Fucking, I'm so. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to talk about SDT, and I just really hope that I have stimulated some interest and curiosity in people to pursue SDT themselves. There is a very good website, which is the website for the Center for Self-Determination Theory, and that's selfdeterminationtheory.org. I really encourage people to. There are talks on YouTube, for example, by the key researchers, which explains this stuff nicely. And yeah, so I would encourage people to pursue this themselves. And I really believe that this is something which needs to spread on the left. And I think if we do learn this at some basic level, it will allow us to think much more clearly about what we're trying to achieve, but it will also allow us to win that argument much more effectively about human nature.
So we've kind of done some of the sub-theories then. We've done organismic is what I always read it as. STDs and orgasmic integration theory.